Thank you for joining us this evening. Uh, I'll give it pause like 10 seconds. I assume everybody's in the webinar or coming in, but just want to make sure folks get in the virtual room first. Really appreciate everyone taking this evening to join us for this conversation. I'll dive in real quick of a quick introduction of who I am and who the partnership is, and then we'll get to all the rest of the things. I'm Jenny Mattingley. I'm our Vice President for Government Affairs here at the Partnership for Public Service. So I handle our policy portfolio, working on policies both within the congressional branch and within the executive branch that impact the federal workforce and government operations. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Partnership for Public Service, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, and our goal is to build a better government and a stronger democracy. And so we work on both the policy issues of making government work better. We have a vision for better government in terms of modernizing services, but we also work on helping leaders develop the skills they need to be strong public service leaders. We help with workforce programming. We have research and data, and just a lot of other resources out there for federal employees, which is part of why we're doing this conversation tonight, because we've heard from a lot of folks that there are questions about what the landscape is right now, particularly with all of the activity around EOs and other presidential directives. So that's part of why we're here. And I know there's a lot of questions out there, particularly as many of the executive orders and presidential directives directly impact federal employees, your families, your colleagues, and really the mission of the work that you do day in and day out. So there's confusion, there's some anxiety, and our hope is that we can bring some plain language understanding to what it is you might be hearing about. And so for those of you listening who work in government and really care about public service, just want to thank you for your service and for doing the work that you do. And so we are here to help support you as best we can through resource sharing, plain language, explainers, and then continuing also to do what's a hallmark of the partnership, which is sharing the often untold stories of federal employees, who they are and what they do in their federal agencies and for the public. So again, with that, I'll take a moment and I will let Kevin, actually, before I go into housekeeping, Kevin, why don't I let you introduce yourself, and then I'll jump into some housekeeping notes.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Johnson. I'm a director on our federal workforce team. So I help agencies build their capacity in a number of different areas, from strategic planning to workshops, to make sure they are properly aligned, as well as supporting their employees.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us for this conversation this evening. Before we dive into what I know everybody wants to hear about, a quick disclaimer. The information provided during this session is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to provide legal advice. So the information is general. It's our best analysis. It should not be relied upon as legal advice. And if you do require legal advice, we recommend consulting with a qualified attorney who can consult on in unique and individual circumstances. So, as I mentioned, we're doing our best to dig through and analyze the executive orders and other presidential guidance in real time. But as some of these leave some questions out there, we'll do our best to provide as much insight as we can with what we know so far, because like you, we are walking through these in real time, and it's only been a few days. So we're learning as we go on some of this. But we'll see what we can do to give you a sense of the landscape, what each says. And then we are going to go throughout and answer questions that have been submitted ahead of time. There's also a Q&A function that you can submit your questions anonymously through. And we are not going to be able to answer every question tonight. I want to thank everybody for being really robust in providing questions to us. We will not be able to get to them all, but this webinar will be recorded and posted on our Federal Employee Resource Hub on our website. And we have a series of explainer discussions coming up over the next couple of weeks where we will dig into some of these issues in more detail and hopefully answer a lot of your questions then. Finally, while this discussion is for current federal employees and how these executive orders and OMB and OPM guidance impact them, it's an open forum. And I know we've got folks, I'm sure, joining us from other sectors, including media, other good government groups, corporate folks. So welcome to everybody, just flagging that we're not going into how any of these EOs impact other sectors. We're just really focused on federal employees tonight. So with that, we will dive in. And before I forget, I've got two other colleagues on the line that you can't see right now. They're kind of our very, very important support on the background, Carrie and Jackson, and you'll maybe hear or see them jump in from time to time to make sure we're capturing questions from viewers and answering what's out there. So as I mentioned, our goal is to help you better understand the different directives, what's out there, and how they impact you. So before we go into each, I thought we could talk a little bit about what we're looking at, both executive orders, presidential memos, guidance. And so, Kevin, why don't we take a quick moment to talk about setting the stage? What are the, do you want to jump into, what are the types of things we're going to talk about tonight? Because I'm not always certain everybody's as plugged in to thinking about this as I spend a lot of my time thinking about.
Yeah, so at a high level, some of the things that we're going to talk about is the hiring freeze executive order, as well as the return to in-person work, as well as some of the diversity, equity, inclusion EOs that are out there. So again, this is not legal advice, but to give you an understanding of what these are and what they mean for you as an individual, as well as your agency.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned the word EO, the executive
Mhm.
orders, right? Obviously, you've got statutes, laws passed by Congress. I'm doing a quick quick summary for I know a lot of people know this, but it's always good to say. Presidents then have the ability to make directives through executive order. Slightly different mechanism is a presidential memo, which some of those, like the one regarding the senior executive service, are. And then OPM and OMB often post on their websites
Mhm.
implementing guidance to help agencies understand how to implement and how to think about those directives that are coming from the president. And so we've got kind of a broad bucket of all three
Yeah.
of those things that we're going to dig into tonight. And so just wanted to make sure that people really do understand that that's something that's out there of different things. And so you've got to be looking at all of them because they each drive different parts of the action that you're seeing from agencies. So um, what we'll look at is really, really, now that we've gotten that out of the way, Kevin, you mentioned a couple executive
Mhm.
orders, and that's sort of this bucket of what I'm calling executive orders and guidance that really impact a broad swath of the federal workforce. So hiring freeze, return to office. And then we've got another bucket of directives, presidential directives and guidance that are really about categories of employees, senior executive service, employees on probationary period, DEI professionals. And then finally, there's a couple directives that really have either um, more of an organizational impact or a broader timeline. And those are ones around creating the USAJobs service. And there's one around hiring that builds on some of the work
Mhm.
of previous administrations. So got a bunch to dig into. And I think we can, go jump right in and really dig into that first bucket of Kevin. I don't know if you want me to go, but we've got that bucket of the hiring freeze and
Mhm.
of return to office. And don't know if you want to jump in and talk about any of those, or I can as well.
Yeah, we can talk about, the hiring freeze and just what does it mean is in particular is understanding that it is not a permanent state. It is a current state and is asking each agency to do an assessment of what is needed and what is required for them to continue their mission operations. And so understanding this is just not um, an action that doesn't have an end, but there's also a mechanism to make sure that it gets started again. And then once it is started, it's going to be done very intentionally to hire those positions that are needed to continue with the president's agenda.
That's right. And part of the hiring freeze is it's about um, their plans due to agencies by April 20th, I believe. The one exception to that plan is the IRS, which has a longer
Yes.
deadline, and that will last until the Secretary of the Treasury lifts that hiring freeze. And now, when we say hiring freeze and it's broad to everybody, there are some exceptions. So
Mhm.
I think that's the piece that people do need to realize, that positions for national security, military personnel, presidential appointments, postal service, and there are other categories in there as
Mhm.
well. And so one of the things I encourage folks to do is make sure you're looking at guidance, and where you can find a lot of the OPM guidance for this, Office of Personnel Management, is on the Chico Council website, which is chcoc.gov, and they have their transmittals or memos. And so that's where a lot of this implementing guidance is posted. So if folks aren't looking for it there, that's a good resource for people to take a look at and find out some of the details of who's in there and who's not. And we've seen hiring freezes before in other
Mhm.
administrations. So I know a lot of folks are pretty familiar with the hiring freeze piece.
Yeah.
We also talked about return to office. And, I think the interesting thing to me was that the executive order was about remote work. And
Mhm.
one of the things I'll share that's on top of my mind for federal employees to understand is that remote work, as you all know, is different than telework. They're
Mhm.
separate categories, and remote work, so remote work is really people who have duty stations in other places. Telework is your your agreement that allows you to work informally from different locations, and it might be by certain days, certain pay periods, things like that. So, um, but the guidance actually digs into telework. And
Mhm.
I think what we've got out there is that much like the hiring freeze, agencies have to re-examine telework
Yep.
agreements. So, and I see Jackson pop on, which means he has a question
Yes.
for us.
Sure thing, Jenny. First question I have is actually going back to the hiring freeze. We have a participant asking, saying that they're still seeing a lot of positions for jobs on USAJobs. Can you maybe just go over again sort of some of the caveats to that action and why
Mhm.
that might be happening?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jackson, and for our listeners who ask that question. There are a broad listing of
Mhm.
including national security. And I would also say a lot of times agencies can make for critical positions, critical needs. Sometimes you can make exceptions to hiring freezes, depending. And so I think what you're seeing on USA Jobs are positions that are accepted from that. I will say I haven't gone and looked at USA Jobs in
Mhm.
the last couple days, so there may be positions out there that are still up even if hiring is frozen.
And that's how it's gonna go, like, some may be a year old or older that people just did not remember to take down. That
That's
might
right.
be also a factor.
That's right. So I would say, look at the guidance, look at what your agencies are doing, regardless of whether what you see is on USA Jobs or not. So, um, Jackson, let us know if there are other questions. Oh, Carrie, we got you. Welcome.
Hi, yes, I'm going to pop on with a related question that I've seen a few folks ask in the Q&A, asking for clarification on telework and remote work. So just wanted to pop in and say that telework, as it's referred to here, is a flexibility that allows certain eligible employees to work from home or another work site for a certain number of days per pay period. This is the equivalent of what we often call hybrid work in the private sector. Remote work would be that work that allows eligible employees to work from their home or another approved work site full-time. So telework and remote work by the government definition are not the same thing. The questions that I've seen in the chat ask for clarity on which or both are mentioned in the presidential directive or guidance. Both are mentioned in the guidance issued on this, where agency heads are instructed to revise agency telework agreements. If you have questions about your agreement, that is a great question to direct to your HR office. They can help clarify what agreements might be in place and how you, the employee, might be impacted by that. And the guidance indicates that agencies should be taking steps to terminate those remote work agreements as well. So again, really understanding there are a lot of questions here. Did just want to clarify that both telework and remote work are mentioned, and encourage folks to ask their agencies with any questions.
Yeah, thank you for going through that because they are very different. And again, the executive order was focused on remote work. the guidance is focused on both telework and remote work. And so looking at the implementing guidance is what agencies are looking to right now. Executive orders are often, I call them directives. They put out the wishes of the president and the policy direction of the president. And then the implementing guidance is really where agencies should look for detail into how those are done. All right. We'll go on, and I'll guess, Kevin, that we're gonna get more questions and be surprised when we'll see Carrie and Jackson pop on screen here. But I would say a couple questions we've gotten ahead of time were also about where to find telework agreements. You know, typically in agencies, and when I've been in federal agencies, you have to sign a telework agreement. It's an agreement that you work out with your manager. That's usually posted on an agency intranet. So if you have not signed a telework agreement in the past, or if you have, but you haven't seen it for a long time, I would certainly go look on your intranet and talk to your supervisors as well. And then, Kevin, one other question that comes up, and about telework and also return to office, are that we've heard are reasonable accommodation. And so where should an employee go to ask about reasonable accommodation? Because that is with telework agreements and with return to office, there is still the ability. Yeah. So
it's going to be
there's still
major.
ability. Yeah.
Yeah. So again,
where do you go? Yeah.
Yeah. So again, this is regulated by the EEOC, so Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So they are the ones who identify what disabilities qualify with under reasonable accommodations, and also keep in mind, they don't dictate what reasonable accommodations you should receive based on your condition. So that is based on your conversation with your director of EEO at your own agency. They're the ones who monitor that and oversee that. And then also with that, your agency has its own process on how they assess what reasonable accommodations or RA are going to be given to you. And then if they also reject it or don't approve it, there's also appeals process. So be mindful of what those are and what that process is, because a lot of that is regulated within the individual agencies themselves. Do know there's a lot of great resources out there outside of your own agency. There's the Job Accommodations Network. It is a great resource for people who have disabilities to gain insights and best practices on not only managing your own disability, but also can you recommend or request reasonable accommodations that meet your needs. And so with that, there again, like I said, there's no standard reasonable accommodation for certain conditions, but there are common practices and common tools and resources that are provided for individuals. So do please check out that website. There's a lot of things that could be answered there. And also don't forget about your own agency partner within the Department of Labor, which is the Office of Disability Employment Policies. They have a great group that really consults with not only EEO directors, but also individual employees on what reasonable accommodations can be provided for you based on your conditions. So those are two great resources out there. So again, the Job Accommodations Network is a website with insight, best practices, and things like that. And then also there's the actual team, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, that also works with the agencies across government, in addition to EEOC and others.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I wasn't aware actually of the other resource. So we're one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier was our resource hub. So those are the types of things, as we find them, we'll be posting resources for federal employees just to go look, because there are a lot of great external resources out there that people should know about. So thank you for raising that. Before we move on to the next guidance in EO, I just wanted to stop and check with Carrie and Jackson to see if there's any other questions. And also, before they jump on, just a quick reminder for folks that as we're throwing out, again, resources and talking about these, not legal guidance, we're just sharing what we know, what we've seen from being around and working on these issues for a while. And Carrie and Jackson, oh, there we go. Jackson came on.
Yeah, Jenny, thanks. Another question we received, and again, thank you so much for everyone submitting the questions. We are receiving a lot of questions, so we are really trying to go through them as fast as we can. Is around the deadline for lifting the hiring freeze, and specifically who the plans are being delivered to. Where are agencies sending this information I think we might talk about that in a few cases where agencies have been asked for information around personnel management issues. Can you talk about where they're sending that and who's asking for it?
That's right. We can get there in just a second here. Well, so I believe, and Jackson, correct me if I'm wrong here on this, is that the hiring freeze is for, I've actually lost my tab on my Zoom. There we go. I knew I was going to have a technical issue at one point here. So
I think the plans are sent to the Office of
Yep.
Personnel Management, and then in
Yep.
conjunction with OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is assessing its budgetary impact.
Yep, that's right. And so, so part of this is that while plans are really individual to agencies, they're also being looked at in a government-wide centralized thing. And I would say that's, side note, is that's a sort of a theme of a lot of the executive orders that we'll talk about or guidance, is that they are, a lot of them are taking what are traditionally done in individual agencies and also have a component of centralizing them, sending them to OPM or OMB for review. All right. Well, Jackson jumped off. I was going to ask any other questions, but one other thing I think is out there and that we should talk about with hiring, well, we'll skip to the hiring later. Why don't we move on to some of the other executive orders that are out there? We've talked about both of those. I'm sure there are other questions, but again, we'll dig into some of these in other webinars. But why don't we talk, Kevin, a little bit about the executive orders that are out there around ones that impact different populations of federal employees. So I think, why don't we kick off, because we were talking about reasonable accommodations, why don't we also move into the DEI-related executive orders? If you want to give us an overview of what's in them and who they impact.
Yeah, so again, as Jenny said, I'll just give a really broad overview because you all will provide links for you all to write into the details. But there's three in particular that impacts underrepresented populations or DEI efforts and practices themselves. The first is ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferences. So this one is in regards to making sure that any programs that is operating within the government or by the government is supporting all people. And so, as you all know, this is why all DEI offices and positions were eliminated in conjunction with this, as well as environmental justice offices and positions as well. With that, as you all know, a number of those individuals were put on administrative leave, and then with the deadline to be reduced in force, we're not going to talk about reductions in force for this session. The next session we'll have on February 4th will provide more details, not only what are RIFs, but also what are your rights within the operations if you are going through a RIF. So do please keep that in mind. The other thing with that executive order is just every agency was asked to generate a comprehensive list of everything they were doing in connection with DEI. So not only the programs and practices, but also committees, services, budgets, and things like that. And then with that, they're being asked to do an assessment of how much that cost. And then with that information, we're not sure how that's going to be shared with OMB, because that number or those programs will be shared with OMB. But also with that first executive order by the president, it did revoke Executive Order 11246. So this is a connection with federal contractors. So many of you are familiar with the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP. They operate the affirmative actions within the private sector, those who are doing federal government work. I know I saw one question was, does that work, or does that executive order impact veterans? It does not. That's the one section within the Executive Order 11246 that is protected. So that's Section 503, as well as FEVRA, that component of it. Do keep in mind that is for those who are federal contractors, not those who are federal employees, but you all have your own rights. That do not forget that the Title VII, a Civil Rights Act of 1964, is still in place. That is a law that cannot be removed without congressional approval. So please keep that in mind, that even though the executive orders are removing DEI from operations as well as practice, it is not removing your civil rights protections under that law. So please do keep that in mind. Also out there is the the gender ideology executive order. So this one is reverting back to making sure that this administration is only recognizing 2 biological sexes. Please keep in mind that is male and female. They are no longer recognizing gender or gender identity. So that is going to have an impact for those who identify as non-binary, gender neutral, or transgender because sex designation is going to be determined by sex assigned at birth. So that is a big deal because that impacts people's government IDs, including your passport. So that is going to change. Keep in mind, this does not impact state issue identifications, but we have heard from certain states that they are following the executive orders at their state level government. Also with this, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is responsible for delivering guidance to all agencies around what the new sex-based definitions are going to be. So there are some definitions included in executive order. There's going to be more details and information as well as guidance that's going to be developed by the Secretary of HHS. And then the last one is similar to the first one, is the merit-based opportunity. So again, they're removing all of the DEI practices, as well as the other executive orders associated with that. Please keep in mind, this is not only impacting the practices, toolkits, and things at the government level, but as you know, a number of agencies are supporting state level as well as local level organizations with toolkits, research, and reports. A number of those research reports and toolkits have been removed from public access. So a number of your partners or others who are in that space can no longer access those toolkits and reports that were once housed on agencies' websites.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. I think you got through all of them. Did we miss any there? Okay. Are there any questions? Carrie and Jackson, thought I'd pause there in case there are questions for Kevin around that. And if not, we can move on to some of the other ones as well.
We have a lot of questions coming in the chat, and again, we really appreciate that. One question that I've seen many times is how emails from OPM, such as the deferred resignation email that folks received recently, might differ from executive actions or presidential directives. And I'm wondering if you can help folks understand the difference between those, perhaps.
Great, thank you. Carrie, Kevin, do you want to jump in on those? Do you want me to?
Yeah, I would say this is not the usual coordination or operations of that office. This does not mean that the emails that you receive are not legit. It's just coming from a different channel. So do find a way in which you can verify that. I think that's part of the question that a lot of people are asking is this is spam, is this authentic, or is this fraudulent? We're aware that that office has sent out direct emails to individuals, and how you verify that varies based on your own comfort, as well as working with your IT office possibly to make sure that it is a legit email that you're receiving from OPM or OMB.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Why don't we go ahead if there are no more questions right now? Why don't we move on to a couple of the other things that impact categories? One of the first that I'll say is it's not an executive order, but it's guidance that's on OPM's website, and it's about probationary employees. And so one of the things that occurred to me today that maybe it's occurred to me before, but today it really was something that was on my mind, is that the term probation and probationary period might have very different connotations in private sector versus what it does in the public sector, particularly in the federal space. And so I know those of you who are federal employees have been in a probationary status before, but just because I suspect we have a broad audience here and not everybody is coming at federal workforce terms in the same way, is that a probationary period in the federal sector means your first typically 1 year in office. And so it's really a trial period, if you will. And so it's not, when I was thinking about it with a private sector lens on, usually the idea of probation means you're on a trial period, but maybe with a more negative connotation. This in the federal sector is you're on a trial period before various employment rights like appeals rights and other things kick in after that probationary term is up. And so it is a time for agencies to determine, are you the right, right fit, right skills for the job, or is it easier to say part ways and or help the employee go do something else that's a better fit? So it's typically a 1 year. Some agencies have 2 or 3 year probationary periods. Each agency is different. And also when you move into, say, an SES position, a senior executive service position, when you were previously a general schedule or other equivalent, then you also hit a 1 year probationary period. And so there's guidance that is on the Chico Council website that came out from the Office of Personnel Management that requires agencies to both list all of their probationary employees, share those lists with the Office of Personnel Management, and also the agencies need to make determinations about whether to keep or remove the employees who are on that list. Typically, probationary periods have been done just internally. A manager or supervisor makes a determination about whether the employee on their team is going to pass probationary period or not. This is a very different approach in terms of sending those lists to OPM and centralizing. Again, that's that theme that I mentioned of centralizing things over to OPM. So I did want to flag that guidance because it does impact a subset of folks. The other one that's out there that's a subset is an executive order, or actually a presidential memo. I even misspoke. It's not an executive order on the senior executive service. And so that one, for folks who maybe are not as familiar, we have our general schedule or accepted service employees. One of the categories of employees, federal employees, are the senior executive service. They are above the GS-15 level in terms of where they sit in agencies. They are your senior career leaders. They're also equivalent senior leader and senior technical positions that are often listed with the senior executive service, although they are all different authorities under Title V, which is the title of the US Code that most of these federal employee laws fall under. Jackson, you jumped in. Pause there. Because that means
Jenny,
there's a question.
So as a former federal employee myself who has been in a probationary period and had, it was actually marked incorrectly on my my paperwork that once I moved out of the probationary period. Can you talk a little bit about, both how folks can check to make sure that their paperwork is in order, but also what they could do to remedy any errors on their human capital forms?
That is a great point. So we'll pause and go back to whether you're probationary employee, whether you've been an employee for a long time. You may have heard of the form SF-50, and that's what lists your employment throughout your service, federal service. And so it also lists time served in performance awards. It's got time served. It's got your military credits, things like that. It's what agencies use, particularly when you get to retirement in looking at your years of service. So you can see your file in your EOPF or whichever form your federal employee file is in. And you can also go talk to HR. Your HR offices can help you see your SF-50 and they can help you work through if there's a problem with your service calculation. And I would certainly, we also on our Federal Employee Resource Hub that we have on our website, there are some guides. We've got some FAQs coming out very soon about how to understand your status, whether you're probationary, whether you're accepted service, whether you're competitive service. And then also we found some external guides as well, because we're trying to serve as sort of a clearinghouse for links and resources out there. And there's one around understanding your SF-50 and how to check through it. So certainly encourage you all to go check that out. All right, thank you for that, Jackson. And then let's see, go back real quick to the senior executive service memo. I wanted to at least call that out for folks real quick. That one is, again, only pertains to the senior executive service. And what it does is basically removes some of the appeal rights for senior executives. It takes away their protections in terms of being employees. Senior executive service already has different protections than the competitive service, than the general schedule, for conduct actions. So misconduct or other serious actions, those have appeal rights to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Typically performance for senior executives does not, but this removes for some of those conduct, for everything, it removes appeal rights. It also does a couple other things. It looks at executive resources boards, and those ERBs, as they're called, are what agencies use as they are looking at hiring senior executives, and there's a certain composition on them. The ERBs then are composed. It's what the guidance and the order requires, that the executive resources boards are composed with more non-career senior leaders on there. So your political appointees by non-career. And then it also takes the performance review boards and rethinks and reconstitutes those as well. Performance review boards are what agencies use to look at across their SES cadre, looking at their performance awards annually. So those are two other things it does. Let me pause there. Jackson or Carrie, any questions on the SES executive order? Or Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, what I'm seeing, there's still questions around the emails, in particular one that proposed a resignation. I think is one of the things that we talked about just before we came on, of clarifying what it is and what it is perceived to be. And can you, Jenny, definitely provide clarity on that, because you had some really concise with it.
Yeah, I think we're getting hit with a lot of questions. So I'll pause on any SES questions and go to the thing that's on top of mind for federal employees right now, which are the deferred resignations. That's been in the news, so I'm sure people have read about it. You may have received emails offering you a deferred resignation. That is neither an executive order or originally guidance, although there is a website, a web page now up on opm.gov titled Fork in the Road, I think, or if I'm correct. And so that has a lot of information on it. But what I will say in terms of just plain language, this is not what I've heard a lot of employees or others externally call it. It is not a buyout in terms of traditionally what is legal. There are authorities called VERA and VSIP authorities, which allow for early retirement or buyouts in private sector. That would be a severance a little bit. It gives you some period of your of money, and there is statutorily, there are caps and they're on buyout amounts. There are also whole procedures and regulation around how you do buyouts or early resignations. So this deferred resignation is not that. So what it appears, and again, this is a place where unfortunately I can offer you more questions or more, encourage you to go ask questions for further guidance from your agencies or for HR, general counsel's offices. But just from reading the things that OPM has put out on this, it appears to be a form of administrative leave. So that's a way to put employees on leave for under the discretion of an agency head, typically paid, although there are categories of leave where sometimes they are unpaid. But I think one of the questions out there, and these are the types of questions that need to get worked out, are typically by statute, administrative leave is only up to 10 days per calendar year, because the point is not to leave employees sitting on administrative leave for a long time. And so it's unclear how some of this deferred resignation actually intersects with current law and statute around the different types of leave categories. So that's something I anticipate there could be additional guidance coming out. It's also typically with things like buyouts and early retirement and things like that, there are funding issues that go along with those, and Congress has to authorize some of that funding levels. I know in previous years under the National Defense Authorization Act bill, they've increased the amounts for buyouts for Department of Defense. That is not what we're seeing in this. This appears to be a different sort of use of administrative leave. So what I would say to folks is there are a lot of questions on this. This is where I encourage you to go ask questions and go take a look at the OPM webpage. Right now, I would also say from what I've seen from that's been put out on the deferred resignation, it applies to all employees. It's unclear kind of the scope, but this is one of those things that I think applies to lots of folks. So, and if you're on different, what also is unclear, at least to me, in what's out there already, and I encourage people to ask questions on this too, is how leave accrual. I know it says it doesn't, you know, in
Yeah.
retirement accrual, I know I believe I saw a line in there somewhere where it said it didn't necessarily impact, but it's unclear to me what the mechanism is for making sure that employees would receive, you know, both the salary and would receive appropriate accrual. Because again, this is a different unknown category. And
Yeah,
that's
that's what I'm
probably
gonna
not
say.
satisfactory, Kevin,
Yeah.
for folks
That's
looking for answers.
Yeah, but you're still providing people with things to look for, is not
Yeah,
assuming that it is a straight one-for-one buyout like we normally
that's
see in the
right.
private sector, where you have to pay attention to your accrual rates, the rate in which you're going to be paid out, and also understanding that if it is classified as admin leave, how does that impact your retirement calculation for those who are eligible?
That's right. Thank you for that. Carrie, I'm assuming we've got a lot of questions on that.
We do. One category that I did want to bring up, because folks have a lot of questions about this as well, and how it might affect them, is Schedule F, or has now been renamed Schedule Policy Career. And I think that you could just explain what this new presidential directive says. How does it differ from Schedule F? How might it be the same? And how might people find themselves impacted? I know that there are some steps in the process. People have not been reclassified yet, but if you could just help folks understand what it is, and how it has the potential to affect them.
That's right. Thank you for that. That's another one that's top of mind for folks. This is actually one of the ones that could impact a broad number of federal employees. It's unclear exactly, much like a lot of these. They were written very broadly. That's sort of another theme across some of the executive orders and other presidential directives, is they're relatively broad. So some of this, the details still need to be worked out. But the way that what I would call the executive order, formerly known as Schedule F, it's now called Schedule Policy Career. In plain language, what it does is allows agency heads to determine which employees are sort of policy making, policy determining positions, and move them from their competitive or other schedules. So you might have seen Schedule D or Schedule B, some of those, and it allows them to move employees from the competitive service, largely though, into this new schedule policy career. Now, that doesn't impact, as far as I can tell, any sort of pay or benefits that, you know, employees would have had as a competitive service. What it is meant to do is remove appeal rights for federal employees. So typically, if you were removed, you need to have cause in your removal. So it has to be for cause. And employees have a whole system, and we'll dig into this in some of our next webinars, that allow you to appeal some of those actions. And there's both appeals for, you know, EEO cases, which Kevin mentioned earlier, and then there's appeals to the Merit Systems Protection Board. So what Schedule Policy Career would do broadly is remove those appeal rights for federal employees. So in the previous Schedule F, the original executive order, it also had some hiring things in it. This one does not appear to have, it appears in the guidance that has come out around it, the competitive hiring still applies. This is purely towards the termination side of federal employment. So there is guidance on the Chico Council website that OPM put out that walks through how agencies should be thinking about, agency heads should be thinking about the categories of employees that are in there. So you're thinking employees, supervisors of employees that are in this policy-making role, employees who are largely, you know, are able to take actions on behalf of agencies. It's got a lot of different categories laid out there, but it also opens the door for agencies to choose. There's sort of a broader bullet point at the end of this list that allow agency heads to kind of determine who, along with OPM, might fall under this category of employees. So we haven't seen it work out yet, but it's a broad category. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. Like, even though there is categories, there is that catch-all, and just be mindful of that. Going to Jenny's point, just it's really emphasis on who has the ability to influence the delivery of the president's agenda. And so again, that can be interpreted in different ways, but there is that direct impact on what is delivered budgetary wise and otherwise.
That's right. Jackson, go ahead.
Thanks, Jenny. I think we have time for one last question, which we've got a few of, and I again just want to thank everyone for the questions they've submitted. We've in this single 45 minutes, we've received over 300 questions through the Q&A. We also received the questions you submitted before during registration. We are taking note of all of these and are working to either get them answered in future webinars or try to get information through our written FAQs, which Jenny can talk about a little bit in a minute. So I did want to ask one final question. There's a lot of uncertainty right now for everyone. For federal employees who have more questions about how to interpret guidance, how it applies to them, both of these executive orders and the presidential actions we have discussed tonight, but also ones that we haven't that are more policy related, maybe not related to the workforce. Where should folks be asking the questions, both in terms of at their agency or otherwise? And then Jenny, could you also close us out and run through the resources the partnership has available as well?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. The unsatisfactory answer that I have to that is that some of these things we don't know yet how they'll play out. We've had a lot of presidential directives and guidance from OPM that's come out very quickly. And so it's still a lot to work through and see. I know that doesn't help when people are worried about how these impact family, colleagues, themselves, but some of it, and as is going to take some time as we see implementation because it requires agency heads. Sorry, I've been talking for a while. It requires agency heads to make determinations. It requires OPM to look through lists. And so that's the unsatisfactory piece. There's also, as I mentioned, as I've heard, there are some legal questions around how some of these presidential directives intersect with current laws and regulations. So some of these are going to take some time to work out. That being said, in the meantime, OPM continues to put guidance. You have your HR offices, you have general counsel's offices, and I apologize to some of my HR and general counsel friends because I know you don't have all the answers either right now and are trying to work this out in the best of your ability. So we intend to, as we keep going on these webinars and sessions that Jackson mentioned, we're going to bring in folks to talk with us who have worked on these issues across different administrations in different ways, who can at least provide their best guess answers into how some of this plays out and explain what are current statutes, rules, regulations, how do those intersect with the executive orders and directives. So really what this is intended to do is tell you what's out there and give you just a start to thinking about it and make sure you know there are resources. Partnership has resources, as do many other organizations out there, and we're linking to a lot of those. Before I sort of close out, Kevin, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback onto what something you just said to those who are out there leading the human capital offices, EEO and general counsel. If you all could be proactive and explaining just what your agency's practice is, because even though you may not know what the implications are of the executive orders, you can at least share with people, for example, what is your reasonable accommodation process? Because not everyone knows that. Where can people, and I saw that in the chat, where can people find their SF50? So some of these basic mechanical things, if you can proactively communicate that to employees, you may not answer all their questions, but you provide them with a higher level understanding of what the executive orders may mean. as well as what questions can they actually ask you? Because as you've seen with us, we can't answer all the questions. Some questions are at the agency level, some questions are within OPM and OMB, but at least if you can clarify what your practice is, your process, how can people find some of the fundamental information, and then what can you actually help them with, and just clear and be concise and clear with that can help some of this anxiety and confusion that is going on.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kevin. And that's where I started too, is ask questions, continue to ask questions about what your status is. Make sure you as a federal employee understand, are you competitive service? Are you accepted service? Those things will be on your SF-50. Other folks in your agencies can help you work through that. Just knowing where you stand. Also, we'll be doing some webinars, sessions coming up in a couple weeks with some federal benefits experts, so you can better understand how some of these actions might impact or not your federal benefits, and you can ask questions about federal benefits and understanding which systems you're under. So we're going to try to bring you conversations and questions to answer, folks who have broad experience in these areas to help you answer those questions. And I think for now, what I would encourage everybody to do, we did a very quick high level run through of a lot of these executive orders and guidance. They are posted. I would encourage you to read them. I know that, they may not be, again, apparent of exactly who they impact and how they're going to be implemented, but it's worth making sure you read those guidance documents that are being posted by OPM, because that's where you start seeing how some of these may play out and who they may impact. So I would say that there are a lot of other organizations as well as ours that are providing explainers and other things. Again, we have a resource hub that I think was put into the chat for you all. And so not only do we have our own FAQs on there, we're posting links to other great resources like the one Kevin mentioned earlier, things that we found just to provide one place, sort of a one-stop place to the best of our ability to go look for information, explainers, anything that can help you just sort of understand your status and what other resources are out there. So with that, I really do want to thank everybody for listening in tonight. I want to thank all my colleagues at the partnership who helped set this up and produce it, and thank Carrie and Jackson. And of course, Kevin, thank you for joining us this evening. And for all the federal employees who are out there listening, thank you for the work that you do day in and day out for our country. It is really, really important. And, we will know that we are here. We hear you, we see you, and we'll continue to tell stories about the good work that federal workforce does and the delivery of services. So thank you. And with that, we will call it a good, and feel free through our website to ask more questions, reach out, and have a good evening.